Hello everyone, I'm back with another McFarlane Toys Batman video, and this time we're returning to the DC Multiverse line, that is the 7-inch scale line, and we're looking at a Dark Knight Rises release. We know this line has been very successful because we keep seeing additions to it, which is fantastic, and this time we have a deluxe figure set. It is Catwoman with the Batpod. There's a fair bit to cover today, so I'm going to dive straight in there by taking a look at the packaging. Now, this is the standard DC Multiverse branding, i.e. very dark. It's essentially mostly black borders. It's basically a black void. There's not an awful lot to this branding. We do see the DC Multiverse logo. The box itself is a very slim, long box, which is kind of cool. And we have this fantastic image here at the front of the packaging, or the top of the packaging, depending on how you look at it, which reveals obviously the figure of Catwoman with the Batpod, which looks really striking actually. This is very presentable. If you want to put this on your shelf or put it on your display somewhere, this is going to be quite eye-catching despite the black void that I've been talking about, and there's a lot of black here. Catwoman's black costume, the black of the Batpod, that seems to be the predominant colour, but all that being said, this still looks really kind of cool, and we do have the specific Dark Knight Rises logo, which is pretty cool. Then if we flip the packaging over, we can see this fantastic image here, which I think has been created for this packaging. I don't think that this was a promotional image that was used at the time of the release, I forget now, but this looks pretty cool anyway. It's a fantastic image here of Catwoman firing some of the weapons there on the Batpod, and this is a lot more colourful, this is a lot more eye-catching, and let's be honest, if you're going to put this on display, this is the side that you're going to be showing off. This looks absolutely fantastic to me, and I love that it's largely text-free. If we flip it again, we can see on the very top of the packaging, this is slightly narrower, but we can see some more images of the figure and the Batpod there, looking pretty cool, and again, fairly displayable in its own right. Underneath, at the very bottom of the packaging, we actually have some small print now and some instructions about assembly when it comes to placing those weapons on the side of the pod. So let's take a look at the Catwoman figure first. Now, I have to say on first impressions, this is a pretty decent sculpt. I think this looks quite striking, but there are some issues which we'll delve into. First of all though, if we take a look at this head sculpt, I think they've done a pretty decent job. Now, the dimensions of the mask look fine, but they look ever so slightly clunky, a little bit off kilter somehow. But the overall likeness I think is pretty good. There's actually some nice paint taps running through this figure. We can see a little bit of blush on the cheeks there. The red of the lips look really striking, and I think the detailing around the eyes in particular is actually really well done as well. And as far as the likeness goes, I think this is a fair approximation of actress Anne Hathaway. I don't think this is bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not super sharp either. It's not the greatest either. Now, the hair is actually stylized, so it's in this sort of windswept effect, which is appropriate given that she's riding the Batpod. Of course, you're going to want to have that, but they've tried to have their cake and eat it here, I think. So it looks pretty good. I have no real issues with this. It is one solid moulded piece. It's a little bit flexible in the sense that it's made of rubber, but you can't position it or do anything with it particularly. But there's some nice washes running through this, so it gives it a little bit more depth and texture, which I think is a good thing, and it looks pretty good for the most part. One thing that I do really like though is the fact that the goggles actually do come off the top of the head and they slide down to go over the eye, so of course you can be authentically riding the Batpod there. I think that's a really cool touch. I think that works really well. This is a soft rubber piece, so it just slides up and down easily enough, and I think this works very well. In terms of body sculpt, I don't know whether this has been entirely recycled. The bodysuit itself looks to be new because it's quite a specific look to this version of the character that we see on screen, and the detailing here is actually sculpted in, so all those bumps and that leather effect is actually sculpted in, which is fantastic. So I think it looks really good. The dimensions look pretty accurate to my eyes, and I think they've done a fairly nice job with this all in all. Where it's let down is there's not really much in the way of paint apps. In fact, there's no paint apps at all, so some paint washes over this would have been really good to draw out some detail and just add a little bit more highlighting, give it that, you know, depth that I'm always talking about. But as it is, it's missing that, which is a shame. However, what we do have is the use of different materials on this figure. So where we have the gloves, the belt, and of course the boots that she wears, this is in a glossy paint, which is really nice actually. So it actually contrasts nicely against the matte black of the main bodysuit, which looks really good, and it gives it that sense of depth, I suppose, and the accuracy of the textures that we see in the film. So I think this looks really good. Oddly, where we do see a little bit more attention to detail in terms of paint apps is actually on the very heel of her boots, which is a very small surface area, but you can see they've actually painted these silver, which is really cool and just adds a little bit of extra nuance to the overall figure and the look, which is quite eye-catching and kind of cool. But where this figure falls down is that she cannot really stand freely by herself, because that surface area there, as you can see, is very, very small indeed, and I could not really get her to stand without the use of the base that she comes with. This is going to be absolutely critical if you want to stand her freely without the support of the Batpod. In terms of articulation, she does have a ball joint at the top of the neck there, and the head will spin all the way around, so that hairpiece isn't actually going to get in the way of that. She can also wobble her head from side to side, which is great, and she can nod it down a fair distance, but obviously when it comes to looking up, that's where the hindrance comes from the hair there. Now, she does have a butterfly wing joint at the top of the shoulder, which is great. It's not a huge range of motion, but it's a little bit extra, which is fantastic. Then she has ball joints in the shoulders, which is great, so that lifts up and out. We have the complementary bicep swivel, and pleasingly, she has double joints at the elbow there. Now, this does have a tendency to make her arms look a little bit too long, perhaps, for my liking, but it does mean you can get her hands all the way back to her head there, which is pretty cool. Now, she does have that frustrating ball joint effect thing that McFarlane toys love in this line, which is a little bit frustrating because it's kind of a ball joint but also kind of a hinge, and it looks a little bit awkward and clunky, but it does allow the hand to rotate all the way around and hinge forwards and backwards. She's got 2 points of articulation in the torso, which is fantastic. She has a ball joint at the waist and a ball joint in the top of the torso, so she can spin from side to side easily enough. She can lean left and right, and she can also bend forwards and backwards, particularly backwards, a really healthy distance, which is going to be crucial for posing it on the Batpod. Now, she has ball joints in the hips, so the legs will kick out to the side. There is a swivel at the top of the boot cut there as well, in the top of the thigh, which is great. So the legs will kick forwards, they'll kick backwards, and there's another double joint, this time at the knee, so that lower leg can kick all the way back there. Then she has that really strange part swivel, part ball joints, pivots, ankle rocker thing going on, which I'm not a huge fan of, that McFarlane toys love to use, but it does allow the foot again to swivel all the way around and also hinge forwards and backwards. And finally, she even has some toe articulation. And just for good measure, she also comes with an additional pair of open hands and the standard display base and trading card. It's a shame there isn't anything more exciting here, but if we take a look at the standard release, we can see that actually we're not probably missing that much, because even here, all she comes with is an additional pair of closed fists, the broken Dark Knight mask, and the box of pearls. So even here, I don't feel like I'm missing an awful lot in truth. And of course, this version of the figure also has the Batpod. So all in all, I think this is a pretty decent figure. I'm quite happy with it. I think the likeness is fairly strong. I think it's definitely serviceable. I really do like the option with the goggles to lift them up and down. I think that's great. The articulation is well thought out and works really well. It's quite successful for the most part. And I think, although we don't have much in the way of paint apps, the different textures that we see there in terms of the plastics used actually works really well in that area as well. So this generally looks pretty good. Where the figure falls down is definitely in terms of her being able to stand freely. That's a major issue. And then the other thing is that, to me, those arms still look a little bit too long, so she looks a little bit gangly, not quite to proportion, but otherwise, this is a pretty nice figure. So then, moving on to the Batpod, and this is definitely a major selling point of this particular release. It's the most exciting element, I think. I really like the Batpod in the Dark Knight films. I think it's got a really cool design, and it was used very, very effectively. And in terms of what they've done here, in terms of replicating the sculpt, it looks pretty good. I'm actually surprised, having it in hand, how skeletal it actually is and how bare bones. It always seemed meatier in the film, but then this really is a vehicle that relies very heavily on the tyres and the gun turrets, I think, for its effect. Now, talking about those gun turrets, this is where we actually see a little bit of paint apps being utilised here. There's a bit of silver on there, just used strategically, which works really well to give it that sort of gunmetal effect, to make it look worn and realistic, adding the depth and texture, which looks really, really good. So I think this is very effective. And if we look at the tyres, these are nice and thick and sturdy, but also got a little bit of bounce in them. Obviously, they're made purely of rubber, and there's not much in the way of paint apps on these at all. And as you would expect, these tyres do rotate, so this cycle can move forwards and backwards. Sadly, the rest of the vehicle is a bit lacking when it comes to detail. There's really very little in the way of paint apps, and there's not even much in the way of decoration to give any illusion of a dashboard or speedometer or anything. There's nothing here. I'm not sure how accurate this is compared to what we see in terms of the prop or on screen, so I can't really comment too much about that, but it still looks very bare bones to me, and I'm a little bit disappointed with that, I've got to be honest. We do see a little bit more in terms of paint apps on the rest of the main body, though, again having that silver effect placed here and there to just make it look worn, realistic, depth, texture, all of that good stuff. And I think this is pretty good, but just feels a little bit too little too late in some places. But again, you can see it on the end of the rear tyre here as well, which looks nice and just makes it look a bit more realistic. But for a sculpt that is so matte and so dark, I feel like it needed more splashes of colour wherever they could, really, to bring it to life. Now, when it comes to placing Catwoman on the Batpod, I gotta be honest, this is going to take a bit of perseverance, and I found it to be slightly frustrating to get it into a position where she could grip the handlebars but also have her knees in the right place and her feet crucially in the right positions. It never really seemed to align for me so that I could get it so it was convincing all the way around, and it felt snug and right to proportion. It always felt like her leg would always end up sticking up or out, or her knee wouldn't be placed in the right position, or a hand would just slip off the handlebar, and it just took me a lot of time to sort of persevere to get something that was halfway effective in terms of the look that I wanted to create. But when I finally got there and made a few compromises, I have to say the overall look is actually quite striking, and it works quite well. Even though it's far from perfect, I do really like it. If you position it just the right angle, it does look pretty cool actually, and it does look fairly reflective of what we see on screen for the most part, if you don't look too closely, that is. Obviously the articulation in terms of her torso is really key here to allow her to really stretch and arch backwards to get into position, and you know, it creates the right look overall. So final thoughts from me then, I'm only going to give this 3 stars, and that's me being on the fence a little bit. It's certainly not a bad release. I'm really pleased that we have the Batpod. It's a really cool vehicle from those films, so of course, I'm grateful to have this in my collection, and I think it looks pretty cool. Likewise, of course, I want Catwoman in my collection. That goes without saying, and I think it's it's a pretty decent figure with some decent articulation there, and it's got an overall good look. And I think these two elements go together really well. Individually, on their own, they wouldn't be so effective, but putting them together, I think this makes it a more attractive package that could potentially lift this up to 4 stars. That said, I've noted some of the issues that I had with both the figure and the Batpod individually, so I'm gonna even the score out and make it 3 stars. There's definitely room for improvement here. It's a little bit underwhelming, to be honest, but at the same time, not enough for me to really complain about. I'm still happy to have this in the collection, and I think it's gonna be a nice display piece. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do consider giving the video a like. That kind of thing really does help the channel out, and it allows me to keep making more content. And if you're interested in seeing more content, remember to hit subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos coming soon.